I'm Mark Robertson, back with you here on Mark Robertson Talks. Today's topic, supply side economics. Wow, that's exciting. No, basically what it is common sense. It's keeping taxes low on individuals and businesses so the economy can thrive, so all income levels prosper or have a chance to prosper. But the left besmirches supply side economics, saying it's tax cuts for the rich, and it's just trickle-down economics, which they claim that our claim is that this money somehow goes from the rich to the so-called middle class and the poor. That's not what we claim at all. Keeping money in the private sector makes the economy stronger, much stronger. It's proven every time. And a stronger economy, creating jobs, raising wages, helps all income levels. There's a chance to help all income levels. The economy grows, economic growth, and we have a thriving economy, and people have a much better chance of doing well in a strong, roaring economy. That's basically what supply-side economics is. They call it Reaganomics as well because he cut taxes. And Ronald Reagan said they quit calling it Reaganomics when it started to work real well. But like I say, supply-side economics, it's just common sense. People know better what to do with their money than the government does. The government wastes money. The government is about abuse and fraud and all these other games they play. It's a disaster. Keep the money in the private sector. Now, the government doesn't like money in the private sector because that they will prove then that government is not really needed as much as they think it is. They don't need these programs for the poor. They won't be able to trap people into poverty and keep them voting Democrat for the most part. And so they don't like a strong economy. That's really kind of crazy. It's not one side's policies versus the other side's policies to get a strong economy. It's one side's policies versus the other side kind of trying to keep people trapped in dependency so that we'll keep relying on government and keep voting Democrat. It's really an evil scheme put forth by the left, the Democrat Party. And every place you go with low taxes prospers. I remember Hong Kong before the disastrous takeover by China, they had tax rates very low. I mean, in single digits. And that was one of the most prosperous places on earth until, of course, the communist Chinese go in there. It's still a good, strong economy. Unfortunately, it's been taken over by the communist Chinese, and who knows how much longer that will last. There's a lot of repression there now going on. And so anywhere there's a low taxes, you have a strong economy, including in the U.S., where taxes in the last 100 years were cut by Presidents Harding, Coolidge, Kennedy, Reagan, Bush 43, and now President Trump. And after every one of those tax cuts, revenues to the Treasury increased because the economy expanded. Millions of jobs were created, the economy expands, and the rich paid more in taxes after their taxes were cut because the economy expanded. And so you on the left, you really want to soak the rich? Cut their taxes. It works every time. Now, the taxes, I got information here, the historical lessons of lower tax rates by Dan Mitchell of the Heritage Foundation. And he points out that in the tax cuts of the 1920s, personal income tax revenues increased substantially. And despite the reduction in rates from 73% to 25%, revenues rose from $719 million in 1921 to $1,164 million in 1928, an increase of 61%. And there was no inflation in the 1920s. That's another myth. The tax cuts bring inflation. That's just a total lie. It's nonsense. And in the 60s, after the Kennedy tax cuts, revenues climbed $94 billion in 61 to $153 billion in 68, an increase of 62%. And after the Reagan tax cuts, revenues climbed to nearly 100% during the 80s. They almost doubled from about $500 billion to about $1 trillion by the end of the decade. And the rich pay more in taxes after tax cuts, like we were saying. The share of the burden paid by the rich in the 1920s rose. Those making $50,000 and up in those days were considered rich, climbed from 44.2% in 1921 to 78.4% in 1928. That's the percentage of taxes that the rich pay, that those making over $50,000. After the Kennedy tax cuts, the tax collections from those making over $50,000 per year climbed 57% between 63 and 66, while tax collections below 50,000 rose just 11%. And the same thing, like I say, with the Reagan years, the top 1% of earners in the Reagan years went from paying 17% to about 25% of the taxes. And so now they pay around 40%. So this is happens every single time. It happened after the Bush tax cuts. Revenues to the Treasury dramatically increased after the Bush tax cuts. They in fiscal years 05 and 06, it was like a 521 billion increase in over a 2-year period, the largest in U.S. history. So tax cuts expand the economy. There's so many lies about the Bush tax cuts as well, but they were successful too until the housing crash brought about by government policies trying to ensure everybody gets a house, whether they can afford it or not, came around 2008. And so, but the Bush tax cuts actually were largely very successful. And John F. Kennedy cut taxes, like we said, and he had a good philosophy on tax cuts. He gave a speech to the Economic Club of New York in December of '62. You can actually you can hear it on YouTube. There's no video of it, but I will read this. I know it's not great to read, but this is really he does a good job of explaining tax cuts and how they benefit society. Our true choice, this is JFK in 1962, our true choice is not between tax reduction on the one hand and the avoidance of large federal deficits on the other. It is increasingly clear that no matter what party is in power, so long as our national security needs keep rising, an economy hampered by restrictive tax rates will never produce enough revenue to balance our budget, just as it will never produce enough jobs or enough profits. Surely the lesson of the last decade is that budget deficits are not caused by wild-eyed spenders, but by slow economic growth and periodic recessions, and any new recession would break all deficit records. In short, it is a paradoxical truth that tax rates are too high today and tax revenues are too low, and the soundest way to raise the revenues in the long run is to cut rates now. That was John F. Kennedy, a Democrat, back in 1962, and he was talking about the 1950s. We often hear that the 1950s were this ideal time, and they were. They were a great time after the war. People were settling in and getting their lives going, and the country was heading in a good direction. However, the tax system in those days was a mess. The top rate was 90%. Now, people didn't really pay that. There were ways they could get around it, but still, it greatly hampered the economic growth. There were actually 4 recessions during the Eisenhower years. I mean, Ike was a good man, good Republican, great general, and good president, but the economy there had problems in the 1950s. It was sluggish, and it was tough getting it going. And the high tax rates hampered it, along with, of course, regulations. And JFK cut taxes, and there was a boom in the 1960s, a strong economy. Now, LBJ came along with his Great Society and greatly hampered that and slowed the economy, and it helped to bring on the inflationary 70s. But the Kennedy tax cuts brought on a strong economy in the 1960s after the very sluggish 1950s. So tax cuts work every time. The rich pay more in taxes. It always works. It worked with the Trump tax cuts as well. We had maybe one of the strongest economies we've ever had before the China virus hit. Record low unemployment for African Americans, Asians, Hispanics, near record low for women, record low for high school graduates and dropouts for youth. So the economy was roaring after the Trump tax cuts and regulation reductions. It works every time. It's common sense. You let people and businesses keep more of their money and they will thrive. You create an atmosphere for economic growth, for a strong economy, and it works. Do people take over? They do it. They get their businesses going. They hire, and it's just it's a great thing. Ronald Reagan came to office in 1980, and he came actually in 81. He won the election in 1980, and he inherited 20% interest rates, about 13% inflation, and 11% unemployment. And he cut taxes across the board, heavily criticized, 70 to 50%, and then down to 28% by 86. And he also cut regulation, and the economy took off, roared. A 25-year economic boom ensued, where 50 million jobs, over 50 million, were created. And it also was a strong factor in Reagan winning the Cold War. He was able to build our economy so strongly that we were able to economically defeat the Soviet Union and communism. We basically broke them. And so that was a major part of the defense effort as well. A strong economy makes the country strong in many ways, including security-wise, national defense. And we were able to build up our national defense because of the strong economy, which was also obviously a great factor in Reagan winning the Cold War. Now, throughout history, leftist politicians have used class envy to raise taxes. The rich have to pay their fair share. Well, who says what the fair share of the rich is? Why do they have to pay more in taxes? Confiscatory tax rates or raising tax rates in a progressive way was an idea of Karl Marx. It's crazy. A flat tax would be great. It still wouldn't be totally fair. The rich would still pay more in taxes, but it's a greater step than our progressive system is today. Although, like I say, tax rates have been lowered, and the top rate now is around 40%, and it's still too high. It should be back in the 20s where Reagan had it. And but what do the rich? What do they do with their money? I mean, do they put it in a mattress? No. The rich, either they save their money or they otherwise invest it. If they have a business, they might expand that. So that's good for the economy. If they expand their businesses, they hire or they maybe pay more in wages. Or they they could purchase something, make a purchase. And if they purchase something, that also helps the economy. It creates wealth. Wealth creation is what grows an economy. It what raises wages, and it helps all individuals. So if you raise taxes on the rich, you actually hurt all income levels. The rich will continue to be rich, but they will not invest in things, or they will just kind of put their money away. They will put it in a bank, and they won't be punished by higher taxes. They will find ways around it, but it will slow the economy and will hurt so many others. An example of this was the luxury tax they put on yachts and large boats in the early 90s, and they wanted to raise more revenue from that. Well, of course it backfired. The rich just decided not to buy boats. And so what happened? The boating industry dried up. So you put all these guys who work in the boating industry out of work or out of business. And so once again, government policy backfires. They think they need more money. I mean, we send them trillions every year, but they always need more money so they can expand the bureaucracy, so they can, who knows what, pay people off or do whatever they do with all this money, or have all these jobs in Washington, all these consultant type jobs and things like this. And so people can do all this and have all their pensions and all that going. It's all about that. And the raising taxes is about government perks for these politicians. It's not about helping people. It's not about the poor. Oh, the welfare state's all about controlling people and about power in Washington as well. It has nothing to do with helping the poor. It's such a joke. There's so much lying and deceit and corruption going on. When the economy is stronger, the best way to help poor is to give to charity. Well, when the economy is strong, people are doing well, they give more to charity. And so supply side economics, low tax rates, it helps the poor as well. It's a win-win all across the board when you cut taxes. Places that have low tax rates, they're always thriving. It works every single time it's tried. And the rich pay more in taxes. There's more revenues. There's more jobs. It's obvious. And the people on the left who don't like tax cuts are not against them because they don't work. They are against them because they do work. Like we were saying, they don't want a strong economy. A strong economy takes power away from them. They want a weak economy so they can control people, get them under their thumbs. And it's obvious. There's so many records and so much evidence that tax cuts and lower tax rates improve the economy. Now, there's a number of books. There's a number of great books written. The famous economist who came up with the idea of supply-side economics or tax cuts, or at least he advanced it into the notoriety of the public fame, was Art Laffer. And he invented what we call the Laffer Curve, that you cut tax rates, you cut them to a certain point, the revenues will rise and keep rising. And a lot of people besmirch that as well. They criticize it, the old Laffer Curve, they call it. They say that's the trickle-down economics. It's never worked. It's always worked. I don't know. They just lie. They just make things up. But I've got a number of good books here on that. And the first couple are by Art Laffer and Steve Moore. Steve Moore is also a great economist. And the first one is Return to Prosperity. And this is the things that can be done. And many of the ideas here are from Ronald Reagan. Laffer was an advisor to Reagan, and he's been an advisor to most of the Republican presidents, they've listened to him. And Steve Moore has been, and Laffer as well, Art Laffer, have been heavily involved in President Trump's tax cuts and the programs that they brought about and how they brought on a booming economy. So that's a very good book. Art Laffer, Steve Moore also have this book here, and it's called The End of Prosperity, and that's what not to do. And so they have ideas on what needs to be done and what shouldn't be done, and as far as getting the economy going. But that anything by Art Laffer and Steve Moore are heavily recommended to read about what it takes to get a strong economy anywhere, not only in the United States, but around the world. It works everywhere. It's a universal idea that works everywhere with anybody. It's about letting people have more power, keeping their own money, their own resources, and not letting it be wasted by government. The book Iconoclast, the rebels who sparked the supply-side revolution and restored American prosperity, by Brian Domitrovic. It basically chronicles the history of supply-side economics and how it's worked every time. It's a great book. And he talks about, of course, what we've just talked about, the 80s, the 20s, the 60s. And it was written before the Trump tax cuts, but he chronicles it and how these people who criticize tax cuts are all wrong. They've been proven wrong time and time again. It's like I say, it's never about what they say it is. It's always a lie. It's always a distortion. They know they're lying, but they fear they'd be losing power. They know tax cuts work. Like I say, that's why they oppose them. Another good book, JFK and the Reagan Revolution. We talked about the Reagan and the Kennedy tax cuts, and this is by Brian Domitrovic as well, but also Larry Kudlow, the great economist. He's the lead economic advisor for President Trump, and it's a very good book. He talks about what actually happened after the Reagan and Kennedy tax cuts, and Reagan got a lot of the ideas from the Kennedy tax cuts and how he defended them, and of course brought those about in the 80s and brought about the boom in the 80s that lasted for over 25 years. And this book here too, The 7 Fat Years and How to Do It Again by Robert Bartley. He was formerly the head of the editorial department at the Wall Street Journal, the late Robert Bartley. And it's a book about the Reagan years, but he also talks about it in biblical ways as well. But he basically defends supply-side economics there too. And also, this is a book I'm reading now, The Great Money Binge by George Malone. He just recently passed away. The introduction by Amity Schley. She's great on the economy as well. But it basically talks about the history of the Depression. And in the Depression, Herbert Hoover greatly raised taxes, and then FDR raised them even more. And so that's why one of the main reasons we had a 10-year, basically a depression that lasted that long. It was obvious. And then FDR brought about every government interventionist program imaginable. That's after Hoover had brought about the Smoot-Hawley tariff and wage and price controls. And it was just a disastrous time. Bad economic policy is why we had the Great Depression. And it could have been avoided. Had the policies of Calvin Coolidge and Warren Harding continued, the Great Depression could have been avoided. Matter of fact, there was an economic downturn in 1920 that was similar to the economic downturn in 1929. The difference was how the presidents reacted. Warren Harding, all he did was cut taxes and cut spending and let the economy recover on its own. Hoover, the great engineer, knew everything, so he got all of this government nonsense going, like I say, wage and price controls, and brought on the Smoot-Hawley tariff and then raised tax rates. It was a disaster. He was supposed to be some smart guy. It was a disastrous the way he handled the economic downturn of 1929. It was really, like I say, very similar to that downturn. Reagan in 1987, when we had the strong economic downturn there, he didn't do much at all. He just kind of waved as he walked off the helicopter and said things will be fine. And they were soon turned around and even stronger. So economies make corrections, but sometimes politicians panic and great ones don't. But Herbert Hoover panicked. Warren Harding, Ronald Reagan, Calvin Coolidge didn't. And FDR, his policies were disastrous on every front. The New Deal was a disaster. It didn't work. It made things much worse. There were more unemployed in 1938 than in 1933. So it's really, economics is common sense. You don't need a PhD in economics. Keep taxes low, keep regulation low, and the people will do the rest. You need a good rule of law, and you need to have that followed. But overregulation greatly harms an economy as well. It's just a bad effect, if not even worse than taxes, but although taxes are very harmful as well, high taxes. So freedom is the answer. It's more freedom. But these government know-it-all bureaucrats, and they do that the same thing to healthcare. They put their little prongs in that, their fangs into those entities, and they bring great harm there as well. The people know what they're doing. Now let them run the economy. Let them run their own lives. Stay out of their lives as much as possible. Yes, we need a government. We need a limited government. They have certain duties they do. They provide a military and things like this, and the rule of law. But for the most part, it should be limited and small. The U.S. government and most governments are out of control. They spend so much money that's needlessly spent. Trillions and trillions. We're $22 trillion in debt. That's ridiculous. But they don't want to reduce the size of government. But it's got to happen, or we're going to have a collapse here coming in the very near future. But thank you for joining us today on Mark Robertson Talks, and we will see you next time.